Hey everyone, tonight, we're diving deep into a story that whispers through the ruins of the Chiapas jungle, a tale lost for centuries beneath the thick canopy of ancient trees. We're stepping back into the world of the Maya civilization, a place of towering temples, hidden tombs, and powerful rulers whose secrets were buried in stone and jade. But this isn't just any tale of kings and conquests. This is the story of the Red Queen, a mysterious woman whose burial was unlike any other. Her tomb, drenched in crimson dust and sealed away from time, holds secrets that defy easy explanations. Who was she? A queen? A priestess? A ruler in her own right? Her jade mask and scarlet-covered bones suggest royalty, but history has left her name unspoken. Tonight, we're unraveling her mystery, exploring not just the grandeur of her tomb, but the world she left behind, a world of ritual, power, and legacy. Before we begin, make sure to like this video if you love these historical mysteries, and hit that subscribe button if you want to travel back in time with me again. And hey, let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing our community stretch across the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe light a candle for that ancient glow, and join me as we step back into the heart of Palenque, where the Red Queen still waits, shrouded in scarlet and silence. The morning sun barely peeked over the crooked rooftops of the village, casting long shadows across muddy lanes. Smoke curled lazily from thatched roofs, and the distant clang of a church bell shattered the silence, its echoes stretching over frostbitten fields and dirt-streaked cottages. This wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a summons, a command to rise from the damp, straw-filled mats that served as beds for the peasantry. You blinked awake, eyes gritty with sleep, the rough wool blanket heavy with the grime of a winter that refused to end. The air hung thick with the scent of stale ale, livestock, and damp wood. Your breath puffed out in pale wisps, the chill biting even inside your modest hut. Privacy was a foreign concept. Your family, perhaps 8 or 9 strong, stirred beside you, a tangled heap of limbs and blankets. The bleat of a goat stirred near the door, sharing space in this one-room hovel, an open-concept design, if ever there was one, where humans and beasts coexisted by necessity, not choice. The floor under your feet was a patchwork of packed earth and stray hay, gritty and uneven. If it had rained during the night, which it often did, the ground would be slick with mud and runoff, seeping through cracks in the walls and mingling with whatever the chickens had left behind. You stepped cautiously, feeling the dampness ooze between your toes, barefoot, because shoes were a luxury reserved for those with coin to spare. The smell was something beyond mere description, a heady blend of unwashed bodies, sour ale, and the unmistakable tang of livestock. Goats, chickens, and the occasional pig wandered freely, oblivious to any concept of hygiene. You wrinkled your nose but moved on, because complaining changed nothing. It was simply life. Outside, the village began to wake. Carts groaned under the weight of firewood, and the clatter of iron pots signaled breakfast preparations. Not that breakfast was much of an affair. A crust of bread, perhaps, if you were lucky enough to have flour last week. If not, thin gruel, scooped from a pot that never truly emptied, only thickened with each addition of oats, water, or scraps of vegetables too wilted to sell. It simmered over a crackling fire, occasionally stirred with a wooden spoon that had seen more winters than you had. The church bell tolled again, louder this time, as if commanding you to move faster. You pulled on your tunic, a coarse woolen thing, itchy and worn thin in patches. It smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, a scent so ingrained it might as well have been woven into the fibers. Layers weren't a fashion statement, they were survival. You wrapped a shawl over your shoulders and stepped outside into the misty chill, boots creaking against the frost-hardened mud. The village stretched out before you, rows of thatched roof huts clustered around a dirt square, flanked by the smithy, the mill, and the ever-looming silhouette of the church. Smoke billowed from stone chimneys, curling into the gray morning sky like whispers of warmth. You watched as neighbors trudged through the muck, heads bowed, shoulders hunched against the cold. A woman dumped a bucket of waste into the gutter with a shouted warning, "Guard as low," before the contents splattered into the street, mingling with the sludge and straw. The world smelled of iron and wood smoke, wet hay, and something distinctly less pleasant. You adjusted your shawl, sucked in the biting air, and stepped out into the day. In the Middle Ages, the morning was not a gentle unfolding of sunlight and coffee, it was a demand, a command to survive. As you walked down the winding path toward the village square, the mud sucked at your boots, thick and unyielding. Every step felt like an effort, like the earth itself was reluctant to let you pass. Around you, villagers were already hard at work. The blacksmith hammered iron with rhythmic clangs that sent echoes dancing through the mist. Sparks flew from his anvil, a burst of light in the gloom. The baker was hauling sacks of flour, his hands dusted white, his face red from the heat of the ovens. Further down the lane, you saw children already at their chores, lugging buckets of water from the well. They moved slowly, their faces pale and drawn, as if the weight of the water was just another burden in a life already heavy with labor. One of them stumbled, spilling half his load into the mud. His mother shouted from a doorway, voice sharp and unyielding, but she did not move to help. Everyone had their own struggles, their own weight to bear. There was no time for sympathy here. Survival demanded more than just perseverance, it required detachment. Your own hands were already aching from the cold, the tips of your fingers stiff and raw. The chill crept through the seams of your woolen tunic, finding every gap, every weakness. You pulled your shawl tighter and hurried on. The bell tolled again, deeper this time, and the church doors swung open. Villagers began to gather, trudging through the mud and slush, shaking off the cold as best they could before stepping inside. The church was the heart of the village, both spiritually and practically. Its stone walls were thick and unyielding, its roof slate-tiled and sturdy. Inside, it was the only place you'd find warmth without fire. You stepped through the doors, the heavy wood creaking under your touch. Inside, it smelled of wax and old wood, dust and something faintly metallic. The priest stood at the altar, his robes gray and tattered, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. He began to speak, his voice rising and falling in practiced rhythm, the familiar Latin phrases blending into a hum of ritual and reverence. For a moment, there was peace. A pause in the harshness of life, a brief respite from the relentless grind of survival. You closed your eyes, just for a second, and let the murmurs wash over you. Outside, the world continued to turn, unyielding and indifferent. But for now, you were safe, cocooned in stone and prayer. The church service concluded with the solemn tolling of the bell, its echoes stretching across the village square like a warning and a blessing all at once. Outside, the air was colder, sharper, as if the stone walls of the chapel had been holding back the true bite of winter. You wrapped your shawl tighter around your shoulders and stepped back into the mud-slicked paths of the village. The marketplace was beginning to stir. Wooden stalls, sagging under the weight of damp burlap, held meager offerings: turnips, wilted cabbage, and perhaps a smoked fish or two, their eyes glazed and dull. The baker's boy shouted prices for loaves of bread, and a butcher hacked at a hunk of meat with a blade that looked older than he was. Crows perched along the rooftops, watching with gleaming black eyes, waiting for scraps to fall. Trade wasn't just an exchange of goods, it was survival. Coin was rare, and bartering was the lifeblood of the village economy. A bushel of grain might fetch a dozen eggs. A smoked hock of ham could be traded for firewood or tools. There were no shops or general stores. Everything was conducted under the watchful eye of the Lord Steward, who moved through the crowd like a shadow, his ledger tucked under one arm, his gaze sharp and calculating. You approached the baker's stall, eyeing the loaves stacked in uneven rows. The bread was coarse and dark, made with rye or barley instead of wheat. Wheat was for the wealthy, for the Lord's table. You could almost taste the grit of chaff just by looking at it. But it was bread, and that was enough. "How much?" you asked, your voice muffled by the wool wrapped around your mouth. The baker's boy squinted at you, his hands red and raw from the morning's work. "2 pence," he replied, eyeing you with suspicion. "Or a quarter bushel of oats." You didn't have 2 pence. You never had 2 pence. But oats you had. You nodded, and his eyes flickered with brief approval. "Bring it by the miller's before sundown," he added. "Or it'll be gone." A nod was all you offered before stepping back into the throng. The streets were growing busier now, the village shaking off its slumber. Smoke billowed from chimneys, curling into the slate-gray sky, mixing with the mist that clung stubbornly to the earth. You stepped carefully over the open gutter that ran alongside the path, a channel where refuse, rainwater, and the morning's chamber pot offerings mingled freely. Further down, the blacksmith's forge roared with life. Sparks leaped from his anvil, the clang of hammer against iron punctuating the morning air. He worked with rhythmic precision, his arms thick with muscle, his face streaked with soot. The glow of the fire cast shadows that danced along the walls, flickering like ghosts. A child darted past you, barefoot and wild-eyed, clutching a bundle of kindling under one arm. His clothes were patched and threadbare, his hair a tangled nest of dirt and straw. He glanced back only once, eyes wide with fear or mischief, before disappearing around the corner of a hovel that leaned dangerously to one side. You moved on. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The path sloped downward, leading you away from the crowded heart of the village and toward the fields. The ground softened underfoot, turning from stone-packed mud to loose earth, heavy and wet from the night's rain. Stalks of wheat and barley stretched out before you, bending in the wind like supplicants. Rows of potatoes, their leaves dusted with frost, huddled low to the ground. This was your realm, your task, the field, the soil, the unyielding earth. You reached for the wooden hoe leaning against the fence, its handle worn smooth from years of calloused hands. The weight was familiar, almost comforting, as you dragged it through the soil, breaking apart clumps of mud and revealing the roots beneath. It was back-breaking work, the sort that leached the strength from your bones and left your muscles aching long after the sun had set. But it was necessary. If you didn't do it, no one would. And if no one did it, there would be nothing to eat come winter. Around you, other villagers worked in silence, their breaths puffing out in clouds of mist, their movements steady and uncomplaining. There was no room for grumbling. The soil didn't care for complaints. The harvest didn't wait for sorrow. The hours slipped away, marked only by the arc of the sun as it clawed its way through the clouds. Morning bled into afternoon, and still you worked, turning the soil, pulling weeds, planting seeds that might, if the weather held and the gods were merciful, sprout into something worth eating. When the church bell tolled again, long and mournful, you straightened, stretching your back with a grimace. A few of the others did the same, pausing to lean on their tools, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. But there was no time to linger. Work called, and time was not a luxury you could afford. You wiped your brow with the back of your hand, smearing mud across your forehead, and bent back to the earth. The soil was unforgiving, but it was honest. It gave back only what you put in. And so you worked, hands blistered, back aching, muscles screaming with each movement, because that was the way of things. That was survival. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the air grew colder, biting at your cheeks and stiffening your joints. The wind picked up, rustling through the stalks of barley, carrying with it the distant sound of voices, the smith's hammer, the miller's wheel, the crackle of firewood snapping under the weight of flame. You straightened again, your muscles groaning in protest, and leaned on your hoe. Around you, the others were packing up, gathering tools, stretching their limbs. It would be dark soon, and working by lamplight was a luxury reserved for the Lord's men, not for those who toiled in the dirt. The path back to the village stretched out before you, muddy and uneven, winding between the fields and through the trees that huddled along its edges. You stepped carefully, mindful of the slick ground, the stones that jutted out like broken teeth. Around you, others trudged in silence, heads bowed against the wind, shoulders hunched from the weight of the day. Ahead, the village loomed, smoke curling from chimneys, the dull orange glow of firelight flickering through narrow windows. The church bell tolled once more, its call mournful and low, echoing across the rooftops and through the lanes. You quickened your pace, eager to reach the warmth of your hovel, to strip off your boots and let the fire chase the chill from your bones. The day was not yet over. There would be supper to prepare, animals to tend, repairs to make before the sun set completely and plunged the world into darkness. But for now, there was the promise of warmth, however fleeting, and the knowledge that you had survived another day. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, its flames licking at the damp wood with a hiss and sputter. You huddled close, hands outstretched, feeling the meager warmth seep into your bones. The hut was cramped, dark, the only light spilling from the fireplace and the thin rays of dusk that slipped through the cracks in the walls. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the wooden slats, and you shivered despite the fire. Your mother stirred a pot over the flames, its contents bubbling thick and slow. Pottage. Again. The smell was earthy, sharp, with the faintest hint of rot. You couldn't remember the last time you had meat, maybe last Christmas when the Lord was feeling generous. Tonight, like most nights, it would be boiled grains, perhaps some cabbage or carrots, and whatever roots had been dug up from the frost-hardened soil. A cough rattled from the far side of the room, deep and wet. Your father lay bundled in furs, his face pale and drawn. His hand trembled as he lifted a cup to his lips, and you saw the dark stains of blood speckled on the cloth by his side. Consumption, the healer had said, shaking her head with the resigned expression of someone who had seen it too many times. There was nothing to be done. Only time, and prayer. Your mother ladled pottage into wooden bowls, the liquid slopping over the edges and dripping onto the packed earth floor. You took yours with a nod of thanks, cradling the warmth in your hands. The first spoonful burned your tongue, but you didn't care. It was hot, and it was food, and for now, that was enough. Your brother sat across from you, hunched and silent, his hands cracked and raw from the cold. He was only 14, but his eyes were already hard, his shoulders bent from the weight of work. The fields did that to you. The unrelenting strain of planting and harvesting, the backbreaking labor that sapped the life from you bit by bit, year by year. You watched him eat in silence, his gaze fixed on the fire, the light flickering across his gaunt cheeks. Outside, the wind screamed again, louder this time, carrying with it the faint toll of the church bell. You glanced at your mother, who nodded grimly. Best latch the door, she murmured, her voice hushed. Storm's coming. You pushed back from the table, setting your bowl aside, and crossed to the door. The latch was iron, cold beneath your fingers, and you slid it into place with a groan of metal against wood. The wind battered at the walls, sending dust and bits of straw tumbling from the roof. You pressed your hand against the wood, feeling it tremble with each gust, and muttered a quick prayer to the saints. In the corner, your father coughed again, the sound thick and wet. He gasped for breath, his hand clutched to his chest, eyes wide and bloodshot. Your mother was by his side in an instant, smoothing back his hair, whispering words of comfort. You watched from the doorway, hands clenched at your sides, helpless to do anything but stare. The fire burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the darkness. You moved to stoke it, feeding in another log, coaxing the flames back to life. The wood popped and crackled, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney, and for a moment, the room was bathed in a warm, flickering light. You held your hands out to the heat, letting it chase the chill from your fingers. But the warmth was fleeting. The wind howled, the walls groaned, and the fire shrank back once more, retreating into embers. You sighed, drawing your shawl tighter around your shoulders, and sat back down at the table. Your mother glanced up, eyes weary, and offered you a tired smile. Spring will come soon enough, she said softly, though her eyes held no conviction. We'll have a proper meal then. With fresh bread and meat. Maybe even a pie if we're lucky. You nodded, but the words felt hollow. Spring was still months away, and winter's grip had only just begun to tighten. You had seen it before, the way the frost crept in through the cracks, the way the river froze solid, the way the fields turned hard and unyielding. There would be more nights like this one. More meals of thin pottage, more days of aching backs and calloused hands. And always, always, the gnawing hunger that sat heavy in your belly, a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and starvation. Your mother stood, stretching her back with a grimace, and moved to the corner where your father lay. He was asleep now, his breath coming in shallow rasps, his hands clutching the thin blankets that covered him. She knelt beside him, brushing the hair from his brow, her eyes softening with a tenderness that you had almost forgotten she possessed. You turned away, not wanting to intrude on the moment, and stared back into the fire. The flames danced, flickering shadows across the walls, and you found yourself lost in the patterns of light and dark. Outside, the wind still howled, clawing at the walls, scraping against the roof like the nails of some ancient beast. You shivered and pulled your shawl tighter, closing your eyes for just a moment, letting the crackle of the fire lull you into a false sense of comfort. But the peace didn't last. A sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet, jolting you back to reality. Your mother straightened, her eyes snapping toward the sound, and your brother set down his bowl, his gaze wary. "Who is it?" she called, her voice firm but edged with caution. A moment of silence, then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. You exchanged a glance with your brother, and he stood, moving toward the door with the cautious steps of someone approaching a wild animal. He unlatched it, pulling it open just a crack, and peered into the darkness. "Who goes?" he demanded, his voice low. A figure stepped forward, shadowed and cloaked, their breath billowing in the chill air. They raised a hand, fingers curled around the handle of a staff, and spoke in a voice like gravel grinding over stone. "I bring word from the Lord," the stranger said, his breath curling into mist. "And you would do well to listen." Your brother hesitated, his hand still on the door, eyes flickering back toward your mother. She nodded, just barely, and he pulled the door open a fraction wider, letting the chill wind curl its icy fingers into the room. The stranger stepped inside, his boots leaving dark stains on the packed earth floor, the scent of wet leather and damp wool trailing after him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy cloak that hung to his ankles, its edges frayed and stained with mud. A hood concealed most of his face, but you could see the glint of sharp eyes beneath the shadow. His hands, thick and calloused, gripped a wooden staff topped with a gnarled iron tip, and a short sword hung at his side, its hilt worn from use. Your mother straightened, smoothing her apron with trembling hands. "Word from the Lord, you say?" she asked, her voice steady, though you could see the tension in her shoulders. "What business does he have with us?" The man stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the low fire, the sparse furnishings, the pallor of your father huddled beneath the furs. He sniffed once, as if cataloguing the scent of poverty, and turned back to your mother. "There's been talk of dissent," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Grumblings in the fields. Rumors of dissatisfaction." His eyes fixed on you for a moment, sharp and unyielding, before flicking back to your mother. "The Lord will not tolerate unrest." You felt your hands clench into fists beneath the table, knuckles widening. Dissent? There was no talk of rebellion, just whispers of empty bellies and aching backs. It wasn't rebellion to wish for food in your bowl or a roof that didn't leak. It was survival. Your mother stepped forward, her hands clasped before her. "We've done nothing but work the land as we've always done," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We ask for nothing but the right to earn our bread." The stranger's gaze flickered, his expression unmoved. "Rights," he repeated, voice dripping with disdain. "The Lord gives you rights. He allows you to work his land, to live on his soil. That is his mercy. Do not mistake it for entitlement." The room fell silent, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. You watched your mother's face tighten, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We understand," she said finally, her voice strained. "We are grateful for his mercy." The stranger nodded once, satisfied, and turned to your brother. "There's a levy," he announced, voice brisk. "An additional tithe for the winter stores. It will be collected in 3 days' time. Prepare your portion." Your brother opened his mouth to protest, but your mother silenced him with a sharp look. "We will have it ready," she replied evenly. "You have my word." The man smiled then, a thin, sharp grin that didn't touch his eyes. "See that you do," he said, turning back toward the door. He paused, his hand on the latch, and glanced back over his shoulder. "And remember," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the Lord's patience has limits." The door slammed shut behind him, sending a gust of cold air sweeping through the room. You sat frozen, the bowl still clutched in your hands, the last remnants of pottage congealing at the edges. Your brother cursed under his breath, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "A levy," he spat, pacing back and forth across the small room. "We barely have enough for ourselves, and he wants more?" Your mother sank down onto the bench, her hands trembling as she rubbed them together. "It's not for us to question," she murmured, though her eyes were hard, resolute. "We'll find a way." You stared into the fire, its embers pulsing with faint light, and felt a knot tighten in your stomach. Another tithe. Another debt to pay. Another reason to scrape by on less, to stretch what little you had even thinner. And all for the Lord, who sat fat and warm in his stone keep while you shivered beneath a roof of straw. Your mother's voice broke the silence. "We'll have to work the west field tomorrow," she said, her tone clipped and businesslike. "There's grain still to be threshed, and the root cellar needs filling. If we don't get it done before the frost sets in, we won't last the winter." Your brother nodded, his jaw clenched, and you felt the weight of it settle on your shoulders. More work. More hours bent beneath the sky, hands raw and cracked, back aching from the strain. But there was no choice. There never had been. The fire flickered and snapped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind howled, scraping against the wooden slats, and you pulled your shawl tighter, pressing your hands to the warmth of your bowl. There was no room for rebellion, no space for dissent. Only survival. And in the harsh winter light of the Middle Ages, that was rebellion enough. The next morning came with a biting chill that crept into your bones before you even set foot outside. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only smoldering ash and the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. You dressed in silence, layering your one tunic with a threadbare cloak, its edges fraying with use. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, clouds stretched thin like wool pulled too tight. Your brother was already outside, his breath puffing in the frigid air as he hefted the wooden yoke onto his shoulders. 2 empty buckets hung from either side, swaying slightly as he adjusted the weight. He nodded to you as you stepped into the light, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "We've got to draw water from the stream," he muttered, voice low. "And pray it hasn't frozen over." You nodded, the words thick in your throat. The stream had been sluggish yesterday, its surface crusted with ice around the edges. If it froze solid, it would mean a trip further upstream, a mile or more across uneven ground. A journey that cost both time and energy you couldn't afford to waste. The path to the stream was narrow, worn down by years of trudging feet. Stones jutted up from the earth, slick with frost, and you walked carefully, each step a deliberate placement. Beside you, your brother trudged forward, shoulders hunched against the wind. "Think he'll come back?" you asked finally, the question slipping out before you could stop it. Your brother snorted, adjusting the yoke with a practiced motion. "That kind of man always comes back," he replied. "Especially when there's coin involved." You fell silent, the truth of it settling heavy in your chest. The Lord's men never forgot a tithe, never missed an opportunity to take what little you had scraped together. To them, you were nothing more than a line on a ledger, a sum to be collected and spent without thought. The stream came into view, its surface sluggish and dark beneath a thin layer of ice. You knelt beside it, your hands red and raw as you smashed through the crust with a flat stone, breaking the surface tension. Water seeped up through the cracks, slow and bitterly cold, and you cupped your hands, bringing it to your lips. It tasted like metal and dirt, but it was wet, and that was enough. Your brother filled the buckets in silence, his movements efficient and practiced. When they were full, he straightened, water sloshing over the edges and pooling at his feet. "Let's get back," he said, his voice muffled by the wind. "We've work to do." The walk back was slower, the weight of the water pulling at your brother's shoulders, his steps heavy and deliberate. You kept your gaze on the path, watching the way his boots sank into the mud, the footprints filling slowly with icy water. The wind howled through the trees, whispering threats of snow, and you shivered beneath your cloak, tucking your hands beneath your arms. When you reached the hut, your mother was already outside, her skirts tied up around her knees as she spread straw over the garden plot. "The frost came hard last night," she called out as you approached. "If we don't get this covered, there won't be anything left to save." You set to work without complaint, spreading the damp, musty straw over the brittle remains of the plants, packing it down with your boots. Your fingers ached from the cold, the skin cracking and bleeding at the knuckles, but you kept at it, the rhythm of the work soothing in its predictability. Spread, press, move on. Spread, press, move on. Your breath puffed in the morning air, each exhale a testament to the life still burning in your chest. After what felt like hours, your mother straightened, brushing her hands against her apron. "That'll do for now," she murmured, voice soft. "We'll check it again tomorrow, but for now, it'll hold." You nodded, wiping your hands on your cloak, and followed her back inside. The warmth of the fire hit you like a wave, and you sank down beside it, stretching your fingers toward the flames. Your brother set the buckets by the door, the water sloshing against the sides, and rubbed his hands together briskly. "The fields are next," he said, his voice flat. "We'll have to clear the west end before nightfall if we want any hope of getting the grain in before the frost sets it solid." Your mother nodded, her eyes distant. "We'll manage," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "We always do." You felt the weight of it settle over you, a familiar blanket of worry and resignation. The days were growing shorter, the nights colder, and the promise of snow lingered in the air like a threat. There was work to be done, endless and unyielding, and no matter how much you accomplished, there would always be more. But you pushed the thought away, burying it beneath layers of resolve. There was no room for doubt, no space for fear. There was only the land, the work, and the hope that it would be enough to see you through another winter. You pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders, the firelight flickering across your face, and closed your eyes. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the scent of snow. And deep in the woods, you could almost hear the distant echo of church bells ringing, a hollow reminder of the life that awaited beyond the fields. The field stretched out before you, a patchwork of brown and gray, speckled with frost that clung stubbornly to the soil. The west end, the part your brother had mentioned, lay in uneven rows, the remnants of the last harvest still poking through the dirt like skeletal fingers. You hefted the wooden hoe over your shoulder, its handle smooth from years of use, and trudged forward. Your brother was already ahead, sleeves rolled up despite the chill, hacking away at the hardened earth with practiced efficiency. You fell in beside him, the cold biting at your cheeks as you swung the hoe down into the frozen ground. The blade bit into the soil, sending up a spray of dirt and ice, and you moved forward, step by step, row by row. It was brutal work. The ground was unforgiving, packed hard by the first frost of winter, and each swing of the hoe felt like striking iron. Your shoulders burned, your back ached, but you kept going. The rhythm of the work lulled you into a kind of trance, each strike of the blade a punctuation mark in the silence of the morning. The wind whipped through the fields, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something sharper, perhaps the distant tang of slaughtered meat from the market square. It stung your nose, reminding you of the scarcity that lay ahead, the thin broths and crusts of bread that would see you through the colder months. "Hold up," your brother grunted, wiping the sweat from his brow with a dirt-streaked hand. "Ground's too stiff here. Might need to let it sit for a day, let the frost break it up some." You leaned on your hoe, chest heaving from the effort, and surveyed the stretch of land before you. He was right. The earth was packed tight, frost glimmering on its surface like shards of glass. You nodded, too tired to argue, and moved to the edge of the plot where the earth softened near the tree-line. The trees stood like sentinels, bare and stark against the gray sky, their branches clawing upward in twisted arcs. The leaves had long since fallen, leaving the ground beneath them carpeted in brittle gold and brown. You knelt beside the nearest trunk, your hands brushing away the layer of frost that dusted the soil. Beneath it, the ground was damp and pliant, dark with moisture. This part would turn easier. You motioned to your brother, and together you set to work, the rhythm of the hoe striking the ground a steady, unyielding beat. The sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the field, and the chill in the air began to ease, just barely. You worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of branches overhead and the occasional crow cawing from somewhere deep in the woods. By midday, your back screamed in protest, and your hands were raw and blistered, but the west end was cleared. Your brother leaned against his hoe, breath coming in heavy puffs. "It'll do," he said finally, his voice rough from the cold. "If the frost doesn't set in too deep tonight, we can start planting tomorrow." You nodded, too tired to respond, and turned back toward the hut. The walk back was slow, your limbs stiff and uncooperative after hours of labor. The path wound through the edge of the wood, the shadows long and creeping, and you kept your eyes trained forward, unwilling to look too closely at the dark spaces between the trees. By the time you reached the clearing, the sun had slipped behind a bank of clouds, casting the land in muted gray. Your mother was outside, stirring a pot over the fire, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked up as you approached, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Get it done?" she asked, though it was less of a question and more of a demand. "Mostly," your brother replied, setting his hoe against the side of the house. "Ground's frozen stiff. Couldn't break the west end. We'll try again tomorrow." Your mother nodded, her hands never stopping their rhythm as she stirred the pot. "Best get it done before the snow sets in," she replied. "We're running out of time." The weight of her words settled over you like a damp cloak, heavy and suffocating. Winter was coming, and with it, the promise of long nights and thin meals. You rubbed your hands together, the blisters stinging with emotion, and stepped closer to the fire. The heat licked at your cheeks, and you closed your eyes, savoring the warmth. Inside the pot, the stew bubbled and hissed, sending up steam that smelled faintly of meat and onions. Your stomach clenched at the scent, and you swallowed hard, forcing the hunger back down. There would be food tonight, maybe even enough to fill your belly, and that was enough for now. Your mother ladled the stew into wooden bowls, her movements precise and practiced, and handed them out without ceremony. You took yours gratefully, cradling it in your hands as you sank onto the rough bench beside the fire. The broth was thin, more water than meat, but it was warm, and you drank it down in long, greedy gulps, ignoring the way it burned your throat. Your brother ate in silence beside you, his eyes fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending a fine spray of frost skittering across the dirt. You pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders and sipped the last of your broth, savoring the warmth as it settled in your belly. There was work to do tomorrow, endless and unyielding, and the frost would only make it harder. But you pushed the thought away, letting the firelight warm your bones and the taste of meat linger on your tongue. For now, it was enough. The night crept in slowly, casting long shadows through the cracks in the wooden walls. Outside, the wind howled with a vengeance, rattling the thatched roof and sending icy drafts through every gap and crevice. You huddled beneath the woolen blanket, its coarse fibers scratching at your skin, but you were too cold to care. The fire in the hearth sputtered and hissed, struggling against the dampness that seeped in from every corner. Your mother busied herself near the fire, stirring the last embers and piling fresh kindling onto the smoldering coals. Sparks flared up, crackling with sharp, sudden pops, and for a moment, the room flickered with light and warmth before settling back into shadow. Your father sat near the doorway, sharpening his knife against a smooth stone. The rhythmic scrape of metal on rock was oddly soothing, filling the silence with a sense of purpose. He barely spoke, he never did, but his presence was a comfort, a steady anchor in the shifting tides of uncertainty. Your brother sat cross-legged near the fire, mending a tear in his tunic with clumsy but determined stitches. The needle flashed in the firelight, threading in and out with a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic. His brow was furrowed in concentration, lips pressed into a thin line as he worked. Outside, the wind howled again, fierce and unrelenting. The shutters banged against the window frame, and you flinched at the sound, your hands clutching the blanket tighter. Winter had come early this year, creeping in on silent feet and settling over the land with a grip that refused to ease. Your mother looked up from the fire, her eyes sharp and assessing. "The frost will be worse by morning," she said, her voice low and firm. "Best we get an early start if we want the west end planted." Your father grunted in agreement, his knife never stopping its rhythmic scrape. "Ground won't break easy," he muttered. "But it needs to be done." You swallowed hard, the memory of the frozen earth still fresh in your mind. Your hands were raw from the work, the blisters stiff and cracking from the cold. But there was no room for complaint. Winter didn't wait for comfort, and neither could you. Your mother turned back to the fire, stirring the pot of leftover stew with slow, deliberate movements. The scent of meat and herbs wafted through the room, thin but comforting, a reminder of the meal that had filled your belly and taken the edge off the hunger that gnawed at you constantly. "Eat what's left," she said, nodding toward the pot. "You'll need your strength." You didn't need to be told twice. You crawled from beneath the blanket and took the wooden spoon she held out, dipping it into the pot and scooping out what remained. The broth was thin, barely more than flavored water, but it was warm, and it slid down your throat with a heat that settled deep in your bones. Your brother took his turn after you, his eyes never leaving the fire as he drank. There wasn't much, just a few mouthfuls each, but it was enough to stave off the worst of the hunger. Enough to keep you working when the sun rose. The night stretched on, long and cold, and the wind didn't ease. It clawed at the roof, whispering through the cracks and sending shivers down your spine. You pulled the blanket tighter around your shoulders and closed your eyes, listening to the sounds of your family moving around the room, the scrape of your father's knife, the click of your mother's spoon against the pot, the soft rustle of your brother's mending. Eventually, your father set his knife aside and stood, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. He crossed the room to the fire and banked the coals, stirring the embers into a soft, steady glow. The light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows that danced and twisted before fading back into the gloom. "Best sleep," he said, his voice low and gruff. "We've got a long day ahead." You nodded, slipping beneath the blanket and curling into its warmth. Your brother did the same, stretching out beside you with a weary sigh. The floor was hard and unyielding, the straw beneath the blanket poking through in uncomfortable clumps, but you barely noticed. Exhaustion weighed heavy on your limbs, dragging you down into the depths of sleep before you could even close your eyes. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and shaking the roof, but you slept. You slept because you had to, because the morning would bring work and the work would bring food, and that was enough. It had to be enough. Morning came with the harsh clang of the church bell, its iron tolling slicing through the brittle air. You jolted awake, muscles stiff and uncooperative, the chill of dawn seeping through the cracks in the walls. Beside you, your brother groaned and rubbed his eyes, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders before reluctantly kicking it off. The fire had long since died out, leaving the room heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. Your breath fogged in the air as you sat up, bones creaking and cracking with the effort. The floor was cold beneath your bare feet, rough and uneven, dotted with patches of dirt and stray bits of straw. You shivered as you stood, stretching the stiffness from your back before moving toward the wash basin near the hearth. The water inside was frigid, the surface thinly glazed with ice that cracked beneath your fingers. You splashed it on your face, the shock jolting you fully awake, and scrubbed the sleep from your eyes. The cold bit at your skin, sharp and unyielding, but it did the job. You were awake. Your mother was already up, her hair tied back with a length of frayed cloth, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was kneading dough on the wooden table, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The scent of flour and yeast mingled with the lingering smoke, grounding the room with a sense of purpose. "Eat quickly," she said without looking up. "Your father's already gone to the field. We'll join him when you're done." You nodded, crossing to the table where a hunk of bread and a wedge of hard cheese waited. It wasn't much, never was, but it was enough to quell the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. You tore off a piece of bread, the crust crumbling between your fingers, and bit into it. It was stale and dry, scratching at your throat as you swallowed, but it was food, and you ate it gratefully. Your brother joined you, chewing in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. He ate quickly, as always, barely pausing to breathe between bites. Your mother watched him from the corner of her eye, her hands never stopping their rhythmic kneading. "When you're finished, fetch water from the well," she said, her voice steady and sure. "We're low, and I need it for the bread." You swallowed the last of your bread and nodded, wiping the crumbs from your hands. The chill outside bit at your skin as you stepped through the doorway, the sky overhead still tinged with the pale gray of early morning. Frost clung to the grass, glittering in the weak light, and your breath fogged before you as you made your way toward the well. The path was slick with mud, patches of frozen earth cracking beneath your feet. The well stood at the edge of the field, its stone walls crumbling in places, moss creeping up the sides. You grasped the handle of the bucket and began to lower it, the rope groaning beneath the weight as it descended into the depths below. The bucket hit water with a distant splash, the sound muffled by the walls of the well. You cranked the handle back up, the rope slipping through your hands as you heaved it over the edge and set it down on the frostbitten grass. The water sloshed inside, clear and cold, and you dipped your fingers in, feeling the chill seep into your skin. You carried the bucket back toward the house, arms straining under its weight, breath puffing in clouds before you. The air smelled of earth and smoke, the faint scent of bread baking drifting through the morning fog. You stepped back inside, setting the bucket down near the hearth, and rubbed your hands together to chase away the chill. Your mother nodded in approval, tipping the water into a clay pot before setting it over the fire. "Good," she said simply, wiping her hands on her apron. "Now get dressed. The fields won't wait." You glanced toward your brother, who was already tugging on his boots, his face set with the resigned determination that came with routine. You moved to follow, slipping into the woolen tunic that hung by the door. It was scratchy against your skin, heavy and worn, but it would keep the cold at bay, and that was all that mattered. Your mother handed you a chunk of bread, still warm from the fire, and you took it gratefully, savoring the softness that melted on your tongue. It wasn't much, but it was a rare comfort in the unyielding monotony of survival. You chewed slowly, letting the warmth settle in your stomach before stepping back outside into the biting air. The field stretched out before you, wide and unending, the earth hard and unyielding beneath your feet. Your father stood at the edge, his back bent as he worked the soil with steady, practiced movements. The shovel in his hands bit into the frozen ground, sending up shards of dirt and ice with each swing. Your brother joined him without a word, picking up his own shovel and falling into rhythm beside him. You followed suit, gripping the handle with fingers still stiff from the cold, and drove the blade into the earth. The work was grueling, each movement a strain against the frozen ground, each breath a sharp reminder of the cold. But it was necessary. The fields needed to be turned before the frost set in too deep, before the ground became too solid to break. You worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against soil and the distant tolling of the church bell. The sun climbed higher, weak and pale against the winter sky, casting long shadows that crept across the frozen earth. Your arms burned, your back ached, but you kept going, driving the shovel into the earth again and again, churning the soil in preparation for the seeds that would follow. It was backbreaking work, unforgiving and relentless, but it was necessary. Survival was always necessary. As the sun continued its slow climb into the pale sky, the work became rhythmical, a kind of brutal dance with the earth. You drove your shovel into the frostbitten soil, heaving chunks of dirt aside, your breath puffing in steady clouds before you. The ground was stubborn, hard as iron in some places, but your hands had long since calloused to the task. Blisters were old friends, and the ache in your back and shoulders was a constant companion. Your father worked a few paces ahead, his grip firm and unyielding on the wooden handle of his plow. The leather strap looped around his chest creaked with each step, the plow blades biting into the soil, turning it over in uneven mounds. He paused every so often to adjust the angle, his hands deft and practiced, and you marveled at the ease with which he worked, as if he and the land were bound by some unspoken agreement. Your brother labored beside you, his face set in grim concentration, sweat beading at his brow despite the chill in the air. His shovel struck a stubborn root, and he grunted with the effort, yanking at the handle until the root snapped, sending him stumbling backward. He regained his footing, cheeks flushed, and shot you a sheepish grin before bending back to his work. The hours blurred together, marked only by the gradual arc of the sun and the distant tolling of the church bell, signaling midday. You straightened your back, feeling the joints crack and stretch, and wiped your brow with the back of your sleeve. Your hands were caked with dirt, the skin dry and cracked from the cold. You flexed your fingers, feeling the tightness in your knuckles, and glanced toward your father, who had also paused to catch his breath. "Come," he called, his voice rough but steady. "We'll eat before we lose the light." You nodded, setting your shovel aside and following him back toward the edge of the field, where your mother had laid out a rough cloth atop a fallen log. She sat beside it, her hands busy with needle and thread, patching a tear in your brother's tunic. The bread and cheese she had packed were meager, but it was enough to stave off the gnawing emptiness that settled in your stomach. You sat beside your brother, legs stretched out before you, and tore off a chunk of bread. It was dense and hard, but you chewed through it, the taste familiar and comforting in its simplicity. The cheese was sharp and crumbly, flaking off in uneven bits as you sliced it with your father's knife. You ate in silence, the only sounds the rustle of wind through bare branches and the distant caw of crows. Your mother looked up from her stitching, her eyes sharp and clear beneath the lines etched deep from years of labor. She watched you eat, her hands still moving with practiced efficiency, and you felt a surge of gratitude for her quiet strength. She was the backbone of your world, the steady hand that kept you fed and clothed, even when the harvest was lean and the winters harsh. "Don't linger," she said gently, nodding toward the fields. "There's still light, and there's still work." You nodded, finishing the last of your bread and wiping the crumbs from your hands. Your brother did the same, stretching his legs and groaning as his knees cracked. He flashed you a grin, and you couldn't help but return it. The work was hard, unrelenting, but it was yours, a part of the rhythm that bound your family together. The sun hung low in the sky as you returned to the fields, its light casting long shadows across the churned soil. The work resumed, steady and unyielding, and you fell into the rhythm once more. The blade of your shovel bit into the earth, the dirt heavy and wet against the metal, and you heaved it aside, one shovelful at a time. By the time the sky began to darken, your arms ached with the weight of the day's labor, your back stiff and unyielding. Your father stood nearby, straightening with a grunt and wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His eyes scanned the fields, the freshly turned soil gleaming dark and rich in the fading light. "That'll do," he said finally, his voice heavy with satisfaction. "Tomorrow, we'll finish the rest." You nodded, relief flooding your limbs as you leaned against your shovel, catching your breath. The sky above was streaked with the last remnants of daylight, the clouds tinged with hues of violet and gray. It was a fleeting beauty, a small moment of peace amid the grueling demands of survival. Your father clapped you on the shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You did good today," he said simply, and you felt a swell of pride bloom in your chest. It wasn't often he handed out praise, but when he did, it mattered. The three of you began the walk back to the house, the path familiar and well-trodden. The wind had picked up, its chill biting at your exposed skin, and you pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The house loomed ahead, its walls crooked and worn, smoke trailing lazily from the chimney. Your mother stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the flicker of firelight, and you quickened your pace, eager for warmth and rest. Inside, the fire blazed bright and steady, casting shadows that danced along the walls. The air was thick with the scent of broth and herbs, and your stomach growled in anticipation. Your mother handed you a bowl, the wooden edges worn smooth from years of use, and you accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into your hands. You sat at the table, the steam rising from your meal, and for a moment, there was peace. The fire crackled, the wind howled softly outside, and your family sat around you, weary but whole. You ate in silence, savoring the simple comfort of hot food and steady company. Outside, the night settled in, the fields blanketed in shadow, the world hushed and waiting for dawn. You finished your meal, setting the bowl aside, and leaned back in your chair, eyes heavy with the weight of the day. Tomorrow would come with its own demands, its own trials, but for now, there was warmth, there was family, and there was rest. As the fire burned low and the shadows deepened, the room grew quiet. Your father sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a wooden mug of ale, the liquid dark and potent. He sipped slowly, his eyes fixed on the flames, their flickering light casting sharp lines across his face. He had worked these fields for as long as you could remember, his hands thick with calluses, his back bent from years of labor. Yet there was strength in him still, a quiet resilience that defied the weight of time. Your mother moved about the room, clearing away the remnants of supper, her movements efficient and precise. She wiped the table clean, her hands swift and sure, and stoked the fire with practiced ease. You watched her work, marveling at her unyielding energy, her ability to wring warmth and comfort from even the harshest days. Your brother had fallen asleep by the fire, his head resting on his arms, his breath slow and even. His hands were stained with dirt, his nails ragged and worn, but his face was peaceful, free from the weight of worry that haunted the rest of you. You envied him that, the simplicity of his dreams, the ease with which he drifted into sleep. Outside, the wind howled, its voice mournful and unyielding. It rattled the shutters, sending a shiver through the room, and your mother paused, glancing toward the window with a frown. "Storm's coming," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. Your father grunted in response, his gaze never leaving the fire. "It'll pass," he said, his tone heavy with certainty. You nodded, though you knew that storms did not always pass so easily. You had seen winters stretch long and merciless, the snow piled high against the door, the wind sharp enough to peel the skin from your cheeks. You had felt the bite of hunger, the ache of cold that settled deep in your bones, refusing to leave no matter how close you sat to the fire. But tonight, there was warmth, and that was enough. You pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the rough wool scratch against your neck, and settled deeper into your chair. The fire crackled, sending sparks flaring into the darkness, and you watched them rise, flickering bright and brief before winking out of existence. Your mother crossed the room, her footsteps light and measured, and knelt beside your brother, brushing a hand over his brow. He stirred, mumbling softly in his sleep, and she smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "He worked hard today," she said, her voice a whisper. Your father nodded, draining the last of his ale and setting the mug aside. "We all did," he replied. There was pride in his voice, a rough edge of satisfaction that made your chest swell. "You had worked hard." The fields were ready, the earth turned and waiting for seed. It was backbreaking labor, endless and unyielding, but it was yours. It was survival, carved from the land by your own hands, and there was something sacred in that. Your mother stood, brushing her hands on her apron, and moved to the door, lifting the latch with a soft creak. The wind rushed in, sharp and cold, and she shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'll fetch more wood," she said, her voice muffled by the wind. Your father nodded, rising from his chair with a groan, his joints stiff from the day's labor. "I'll come with you," he said, his tone gruff but warm. She smiled, her eyes bright with gratitude, and together they stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind them. You listened to the muffled crunch of their footsteps, the low murmur of their voices carried on the wind, and felt a pang of something sharp and undefinable settle in your chest. You glanced toward the fire, its light flickering low and steady, and felt the weight of the day settle over you. Your hands ached, your back throbbed, and your eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but there was peace in it too, a kind of quiet satisfaction that you clung to. The work was hard, unyielding, but it was honest. It was real. The door creaked open, sending a gust of cold air swirling through the room, and your parents stepped back inside, their arms laden with firewood. Your father stacked the logs by the hearth, his movements deliberate and steady, while your mother set a few pieces on the fire, coaxing the flames back to life. The room brightened, the shadows retreating to the corners, and you felt the warmth seep back into your bones. Your mother dusted her hands off and moved to the window, her gaze drifting over the fields, now shrouded in darkness. "It's going to be a hard winter," she said softly, her voice laced with something heavy and unspoken. Your father joined her, his hand settling on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He replied, his tone resigned but resolute. "But we'll manage. We always do." You watched them stand there, side by side, their figures etched in firelight and shadow, and felt a surge of pride well up in your chest. This was your family. Strong, resilient, unyielding. Bound to the land and to each other by ties stronger than blood. The wind howled outside, the fire crackled, and for a moment, there was only silence, deep and profound. Finally, your mother turned away from the window, her hands smoothing her apron as she moved back to the hearth. "Off to bed with you now," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Morning comes early, and there's work to be done." You nodded, rising from your chair with a groan, your muscles protesting the movement. Your brother stirred by the fire, rubbing his eyes and blinking at the sudden motion. He yawned, stretching his arms above his head, and stumbled to his feet, trailing after you toward the small alcove that served as your sleeping space. The straw mattress was lumpy and uneven, the blankets rough and worn, but it was warm, and that was enough. You crawled beneath the covers, pulling them tight around your shoulders, and closed your eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the murmur of your parents' voices drifting from the other room. The wind howled outside, fierce and unyielding, but you were safe, cocooned in warmth and family, and for that moment, that single breath of peace, it was enough. The morning came with the bite of frost. You woke to the sound of your mother stirring the fire, the crackling flames sending shadows dancing along the rough wooden walls. The chill clung to everything, your breath visible in the air, the blanket stiff with the dampness of the night. Outside, the world lay still, the fields shrouded in a thin layer of frost that glittered under the pale light of dawn. You rolled from the mattress, the straw crackling beneath you, and pulled your cloak tightly around your shoulders. Your brother stirred beside you, groaning as he stretched out limbs stiff from sleep. "Get up," you whispered, nudging him with your foot. He groaned again, but the urgency in your voice brought him around. Mornings came fast, and the work even faster. Your mother was already busy, her hands red from the cold as she stirred a pot over the fire. The smell of pottage, a watery stew of grains and vegetables, filled the room. It was thin, barely enough to coat the bottom of the bowl, but it was warm. She ladled out portions for each of you, her hands moving with the precision of practice, and you took your bowl gratefully, holding it close to steal the heat from the steam. Your father entered from outside, his boots caked with mud, a rough woolen scarf wrapped tight around his neck. His breath came in white clouds, and he stamped his feet to knock the frost from his toes. "It's colder than a witch's curse out there," he grumbled, settling himself near the fire. You handed him his bowl, and he nodded in thanks, sipping the hot broth with closed eyes. There was little conversation. Mornings were for eating, dressing, and steeling oneself for the long hours ahead. You pulled on your boots, the leather cracked from wear, and fastened the laces with stiff fingers. Outside, the frost glistened like shattered glass across the fields, and the sun hung low in the sky, pale and distant, offering little warmth. "Today's the last of the fields," your father said, his voice low and steady. He glanced at you and your brother, his eyes hard but not unkind. "We'll finish what we can before the ground freezes." After that, he didn't finish the sentence, but you understood. After that, the fields would be still and lifeless, waiting under the snow for the first signs of spring. You nodded, setting your empty bowl aside and pulling on your gloves. They were thin, barely more than scraps of leather stitched together, but they kept the wind from biting too deeply. Your brother fumbled with his cloak, his hands shaking as he tied the frayed ends beneath his chin. "You ready?" you asked, your voice muffled by the scarf you pulled up around your mouth. He nodded, his eyes wide and solemn, and together you followed your father out into the morning. The cold slapped you in the face as you stepped outside, sharp and unforgiving. Your breath came in clouds, swirling in the air before disappearing into the crisp blue of the sky. The field stretched out before you, long rows of dirt and stubble, the remnants of the last harvest lying brittle and frost-covered beneath your feet. Your father led the way, his stride long and steady, and you hurried to keep up, your boots crunching through the frost with every step. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a reminder of the work still left to do. The tools lay where you had left them the day before, hoes, spades, and wooden rakes, their handles slick with frost. You picked up your hoe, the wood cold against your palms, and took your place beside your father. "Straight lines today," he said, his voice gruff but clear. "No cutting corners. We do it right, or we don't do it at all." You nodded, setting the blade to the earth and pressing down with all your weight. The ground was hard, unyielding beneath your feet, but you pushed through, breaking the frostbitten crust and turning the soil beneath. The work was slow, methodical. Your hands ached with the effort, the cold seeping through your gloves and biting into your bones. But there was a rhythm to it, a sense of purpose in the repetition. One row, then another. You moved in silence, the only sounds the scrape of metal against earth and the distant caw of crows circling above. Hours passed, the sun creeping higher in the sky, though its warmth never reached you. Your breath fogged the air, your muscles ached, but you pressed on, driven by necessity and habit. The earth turned beneath your hands, row by row, the field slowly giving way to the rhythm of your labor. Your father worked beside you, his movement steady and practiced, each swing of his hoe precise and controlled. He didn't speak much, there was no need. The work spoke for itself, the rhythm of it etched into your bones. Your brother followed behind, his smaller hand struggling with the weight of his rake, but he kept pace, his face set with determination. At midday, you stopped for water, the liquid icy and sharp against your throat. You drank deeply, savoring the chill, and wiped your mouth with the back of your hand. Your mother had brought bread and cheese, wrapped in cloth and tied with string, and you ate in silence, your hands trembling from the cold and the effort. Your father stretched his back, his hands pressed against the small of it, and grunted softly. "Not much more to go," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "We finish this today." You nodded, swallowing the last of your bread, and set your hands back to the hoe, the weight of it familiar and solid. The sun hung low in the sky by the time you finished, the last row turned and smoothed, the soil dark and rich beneath your feet. You straightened, rubbing the ache from your back, and looked out over the fields. They were ready, the earth bare and waiting, the frost melting in the afternoon light. Your father clapped you on the shoulder, his hand heavy and warm. "Good work," he said simply. You nodded, too tired to speak, and together you gathered the tools, your hands stiff and clumsy with cold. The walk back to the house was silent, the wind biting at your cheeks, but there was pride in your father's eyes, a flicker of something deep and unspoken. The house was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth, and your mother bustled about the kitchen, her hands busy with bowls and spoons. You sank into your chair, the warmth seeping into your bones, and closed your eyes, letting the sounds of the house wash over you. The wind howled outside, fierce and unyielding, but you were safe, cocooned in warmth and family, and for that moment, that single breath of peace, it was enough. Night settled over the village with a heavy stillness, the kind that blankets the world in silence and leaves only the crackle of fire and the whisper of the wind. Your body ached from the day's labor, muscles sore and stiff, hands raw from the constant friction of wood against flesh. But the house was warm, and the scent of stew simmering over the fire filled the air, rich and savory. Your mother worked quietly, ladling the thick broth into wooden bowls, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The stew was simple, root vegetables, bits of salted meat, and herbs from the garden, but it was hot and filling. She passed the bowls around, her face lined with fatigue but softened by the firelight. Your father nodded in thanks, his eyes heavy with the weariness of the day, and you took your own with a murmured word of gratitude. The family gathered around the small wooden table, the flicker of the fire casting shadows that danced along the walls. The room was sparse, rough wooden furniture, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and preserved meats, the floor swept clean but still dirt-packed. Yet it was home, and in the flickering light of the fire, it felt almost safe, almost untouchable by the harshness of the world outside. You ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the soft crackle of the fire. The stew was hot, the broth thick and heavy on your tongue. You could taste the earthiness of the potatoes, the sharpness of the onions, the salt of the meat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Your father leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs before the fire, and sighed deeply. "Fields are done," he said simply, his voice rough but content. He glanced around the table, his gaze lingering on each of you in turn. "Now we wait." You knew what that meant. Winter was coming, the fields lying still beneath frost and snow, the livestock huddled together for warmth. There would be little work in the coming months, just enough to keep the animals fed and the house in order. But winter brought its own trials, cold that seeped through walls, sickness that crept in with the chill, hunger that bit harder with each passing day. But for tonight, there was food and fire and family, and that was enough. Your mother poured a bit of ale into wooden cups, her hands steady despite the wear of the day, and passed them around. The drink was strong, the bitterness sharp on your tongue, but it warmed you from the inside, spreading through your veins like fire. Your father raised his cup, his gaze steady. "To another year," he said simply, his voice heavy with the weight of survival. "May the gods be kind." You raised your own cup, the wood rough against your palms, and took a long drink, the warmth settling in your belly. It was a simple ritual, but it mattered. It bound you together, reminded you that no matter how hard the days became, you faced them together. Outside, the wind howled, the branches of the old oak tree scraping against the roof like the claws of some great beast. But inside, the fire burned bright, and the shadows danced, and the world felt small and contained, just for a moment. When the meal was finished, your mother cleared the bowls, her hands moving with the quiet efficiency of habit. Your father leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, his breathing heavy and slow. You helped your brother stack the wood by the fire, the logs heavy in your arms, the dust and splinters biting into your skin. He grinned at you, his eyes bright despite the exhaustion, and you couldn't help but grin back. It wasn't much, but it was yours. As the fire burned low, the house settled into quiet. Your mother mended clothes by the flickering light, her needle flashing in the shadows. Your father snored softly, his head tilted back against the wooden chair. You sat by the fire, your legs curled beneath you, watching the flames dance and twist. The wind howled outside, but you were safe, for now. You could hear the whisper of voices from the neighboring houses, the soft murmur of families settling in for the night. The village was quiet, tucked away beneath the shadows of the hills, its people bound together by the rhythm of the seasons, by the turning of the earth. You pulled your cloak tighter around your shoulders, the fabric rough but warm, and closed your eyes. The fire crackled, sending sparks skittering up the chimney, and you let the warmth seep into your bones, banishing the chill that clung to your skin. There was work to be done tomorrow, there was always work, but for tonight, there was peace. The night deepened, the shadows thickening, the fire burning low. Your mother set aside her sewing, her fingers stiff from the cold, and banked the fire, her movements slow and deliberate. "To bed now," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "Morning comes quick." You rose, stretching out the stiffness in your limbs, and moved toward the pallet you shared with your brother. The straw was rough beneath you, the blanket heavy and thick with the weight of the years, but it was warm, and the fire still flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. You pulled the blanket up to your chin, feeling the weight settle over you, pressing you into the mattress. Your brother curled up beside you, his breath soft and steady, his body warm against yours. You closed your eyes, listening to the wind howl and the fire crackle, and let the warmth pull you under. The world outside was hard and unforgiving, but here, in the flickering light of the fire, in the warmth of family and the quiet of the night, there was something close to comfort, something that almost felt like peace. Morning crept in slowly, a pale light seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. You blinked awake, the chill biting at your skin even beneath the heavy woolen blanket. Your brother stirred beside you, his breath puffing out in small clouds of mist. Winter was coming, and the frost had already begun to creep along the edges of the window, delicate patterns swirling across the glass like lace. You rose slowly, every joint stiff and aching, your body protesting the movement after the strain of the previous day. The floor was cold beneath your feet, the dirt packed hard and unyielding. You rubbed your arms, trying to chase away the chill, and moved toward the hearth where your mother was already stoking the fire back to life. She glanced up as you approached, her eyes heavy with fatigue but softened by the glow of the flames. "Get the water," she said quietly, her voice rough from sleep. You nodded and pulled on your boots, the leather stiff and cracked from years of use. They didn't fit quite right anymore, your toes crammed together, the soles worn nearly smooth, but they were the only ones you had, and you made do. You grabbed the wooden bucket from its place by the door and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The sky was still gray with dawn, the village shrouded in mist that clung to the ground like a veil. Your breath puffed out before you, visible and sharp, and you shivered, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The well stood at the edge of the village, its stone walls covered in a thin layer of frost. You grasped the rope and began to turn the crank, the wooden handle rough against your palms. The bucket descended with a soft creak, the rope groaning under the weight, until it splashed into the water below. You hauled it back up slowly, the muscles in your arms straining against the weight. When the bucket emerged, the water inside shimmered, the surface rippling with each step you took back toward the house. The weight of it dragged at your shoulders, the chill seeping through the wood and biting at your skin. By the time you reached the door, your arms were burning, your fingers numb. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, filling the room with the scent of wood smoke. Your mother nodded as you set the bucket down by the hearth, her hands already reaching for it. She poured some into the iron pot hanging above the flames, the water hissing and steaming as it hit the metal. The rest she saved for washing and drinking, carefully covering it with a cloth to keep out the dust. "Eat something," she said, nodding toward the small wooden table where a loaf of bread and a hunk of cheese sat waiting. You tore off a piece of the bread, the crust hard and rough beneath your fingers, and bit into it. It was stale, tough to chew, but it filled your belly, and that was enough. Your father entered then, his boots heavy against the floor, his face ruddy from the cold. He nodded to you, a brief acknowledgement, and moved to the fire, rubbing his hands together briskly. "Fields are frozen," he said simply, his voice low and gruff. "We'll have to break the ground before noon." You nodded, swallowing the last of the bread and brushing the crumbs from your hands. It wasn't unexpected. Winter came hard and fast, and the land had to be prepared. There was no room for delay, not when survival hung in the balance. Your mother handed you a wooden cup filled with weak ale, and you drank deeply, the bitter liquid burning slightly as it went down. It wasn't strong, barely more than flavored water, but it was safe, unlike the well water, which could sicken you if it wasn't boiled first. When the meal was done, you rose and pulled on your cloak once more, the fabric still damp from the morning mist. Your father nodded, and together you stepped out into the chill, the wind biting at your face. Frost covered the fields in a thin layer of white, glittering in the early light like shattered glass. Your father handed you a spade, his grip firm and steady. "We start by the east field," he said simply, and you nodded, following him across the frozen ground. The earth was hard beneath your boots, unyielding and stubborn. You drove the spade into it, the blade biting into the frostbitten soil, and levered up a clump of dirt. It came away slowly, clinging to the metal with a kind of grim determination. Your father did the same, his movements slow but steady, a rhythm born of years of practice. The work was hard, your muscles protesting with each stroke, your breath coming in sharp bursts of fog. But you kept going, moving methodically down the row, your father beside you. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, but the chill remained, clinging to your skin like a second layer. It was hours before you stopped, the field now turned and ready for winter planting. Your back ached, your hands raw and blistered, but there was satisfaction in the work, a sense of accomplishment that came from knowing that this turning of the soil, this breaking of the earth, was survival. It was the only thing that stood between your family and the creeping shadow of hunger. Your father straightened, stretching his back with a groan, and wiped the sweat from his brow. He glanced at you, his eyes tired but proud, and nodded once. "Good work," he said simply, and that was enough. The walk back to the house was quiet, the frost now melted, the fields glistening with damp. Inside, the fire was still burning, the scent of stew filling the room. You stripped off your boots, the leather cracked and caked with mud, and set them by the door. Your mother looked up from her place by the fire and smiled, her eyes soft with pride. "Soup's nearly ready," she said quietly, and you nodded, the warmth of the room seeping into your bones. You sat by the fire, your hand stretched out toward the flames, and watched as your mother ladled thick stew into wooden bowls. She passed one to you, her hands rough but gentle, and you took it gratefully, the heat burning your palms through the wood. The taste was rich, hearty, the vegetables soft and warm, the meat tender. You ate slowly, savoring each bite, letting the warmth spread through you. Outside, the wind howled, the sky darkening as evening crept in. But inside, there was fire and food and family, and for now, that was enough. Evening descended slowly, a heavy curtain of darkness that swallowed the last light of day. Outside, the wind picked up, moaning through the cracks in the wooden walls, sending chills creeping across the floor. You pulled your cloak tighter, the coarse wool scratching at your neck, but you were grateful for its warmth. Winter had a way of settling into your bones, lingering long after the fire had burned low. Your mother stirred the pot hanging above the hearth, the thick broth bubbling quietly, the scent of herbs and meat filling the small room. Beside her, your younger sister kneaded dough, her hands dusted with flour, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was a rare treat, bread baked fresh instead of hardened crusts that had to be soaked in ale to be chewable. Tonight, there would be warmth, real warmth, from food that filled not just the belly, but the spirit. Your father entered, shaking the cold from his shoulders, his boots heavy with mud and frost. He nodded to you and then to your sister, his face softened with a rare smile. "The sheep are penned and the gates are locked," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wolves are out. I saw tracks by the river." A flicker of unease passed through the room. Wolves were always a threat in winter, when hunger drove them closer to the village. They hunted in packs, shadows slipping through the mist, eyes glinting with desperation. Last winter, old Marek's cow had been dragged off in the night, its bones found picked clean and scattered by the edge of the forest. Your father set his bow by the door, the string taut and freshly waxed. He caught your eye and gave a nod, the message clear. You would be joining him tonight on watch. You swallowed hard, the familiar tension settling into your stomach. The cold was one thing. The wolves were another. Dinner was quiet, the fire crackling softly, the stew warm and rich in your bowl. Your mother passed the bread around, the crust still steaming, and you tore off a piece, savoring the softness. The simple act of eating felt like a luxury, each bite a reminder that not all were so lucky. Hunger was a familiar companion in the village, a shadow that lurked at the edge of every season. But tonight, at least, you were full. When the meal was done, your mother cleared the bowls, wiping her hands on her apron. "Stay by the fire," she told your sister, her voice gentle but firm. "Don't open the door for anyone. Not tonight." Your sister nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. She was still young, but she knew the dangers. Everyone did. You pulled on your cloak, the fabric heavy and smelling faintly of damp earth, and reached for your father's spare bow. The wood was cool under your hands, the string firm. You slung a quiver over your shoulder, the fletching of the arrows brushing against your back. "Ready?" your father asked, his voice low. You nodded, and together you stepped out into the night. The cold bit at your skin immediately, sharp and unyielding. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light spilling across the frozen fields, casting long shadows that stretched and wavered with the wind. You followed your father along the edge of the pasture, your breath misting before you, your eyes scanning the darkness for movement. The fence was intact, the posts thick and sturdy, the wire strung taut. Your father tested it with his hands, nodding in approval. "They won't come through here," he murmured, more to himself than to you. "But the woods." He didn't need to finish the thought. The woods were dense and thick, stretching for miles beyond the village, a tangle of shadows and secrets. In the summer, you and your friends would explore its edges, daring each other to go deeper, to run until the trees swallowed you whole. But in winter, it was a different place entirely. The branches clawed at the sky, stripped of their leaves, stark and skeletal. The wind whispered through them, carrying with it the distant howls of creatures you did not care to imagine. You reached the edge of the fence, where the fields gave way to the tree line, and your father stopped, motioning for you to be still. He listened, his head cocked slightly, his breath slow and steady. You strained to hear, but the only sound was the wind, sighing through the branches. Then, a howl. Low and mournful, drifting across the fields like smoke. Your grip tightened on the bough, your heart beating in your throat. Another howl answered, closer this time, the call of the pack stretching across the frozen ground. Your father turned to you, his eyes sharp. "We wait," he whispered. "If they cross the line, we drive them back. If not, we hold." You nodded, your hands steady despite the tremor of fear that threaded through your veins. You had done this before. Last winter, and the winter before that. But it never got easier. The wolves were desperate, driven by hunger and cold, and desperation made them bold. You stood shoulder to shoulder with your father, your eyes trained on the line where shadow met moonlight. The howls grew louder, closer, and you could almost feel the tremor of their footsteps in the ground beneath you. But the line held. The fence stood firm, and the wolves did not come. Not tonight. When the howls faded back into the woods, your father lowered his bow, nodding with grim satisfaction. "They know better," he muttered, his breath curling in the air. But you saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on the tree line just a moment longer than necessary. He knew, as you did, that hunger was a patient beast. It would wait, it would circle, and eventually, it would come back. But tonight, you would sleep. Tonight, the fire would burn, the bread would be warm, and the wolves would stay in the shadows. And sometimes, in the harsh grip of winter, that was victory enough. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Palenque endures, not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, now whispers across centuries, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still resists full understanding. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name. No stela told her story. And yet the care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her crimson-drenched bones, all speak of a woman profoundly important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen forces us to re-evaluate assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal have long taken the spotlight, the Red Queen's re-emergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasures she left behind. It's the conversation she started among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in Temple 13 tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story, not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless but not voiceless. Mysterious but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death, she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow, she speaks.